Welcome, tank fans, to Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. I'm Rob.
And I'm John.
And we're talking about a tank today, John. Which tank is that?
We're talking about the Chieftain. But what episode is it, Rob?
It's episode 36, and it's the 13th of August, 2022.
Black Saturday.
Black Saturday?
Yeah.
Well, it's a lovely cold, warm day in Canberra here at 13 degrees, and we're having a great old time. We're going to talk about some tanks and drink some beers. Cheers to that. But the Chieftain, not Nicholas Moran, who is well known on the internet as the Chieftain.
Makes it very hard to search for the Chieftain.
It does. There's many videos. I just got dragged down many YouTube rabbit holes by searching for the Chieftain tank, and there was Nicholas talking about some other tank, and I'm going, oh, I haven't read about that one. I'll go have a look at that. But that's for another time. Today we're talking about FV4201 Chieftain, the British replacement for the Centurion.
Yes.
The first NATO tank to have a 120mm gun.
But the wrong 120mm gun.
Yes. Yes. Well, sorry, it wasn't the first. It was the first MBT, whereas the Conqueror had which was the super heavy tank, or whatever you want to call it.
That's going to be a fun episode when we do Conqueror, actually. This is going to be a fun episode too. But
they're all fun episodes.
Trust me.
But it was when the British had the Centurion and then the Conqueror as their two main line tanks during the 50s, they already knew that they needed a new tank to replace both of those, and they're into one chassis, and that's where they came up with the Chieftain. So they wanted the 120mm gun. It's rifled, obviously, because it's British. Well,
to be fair, all tank guns were rifled up until this point. They kind of just missed the train with a change of direction.
Yeah, where the Leopard came in and said, you know what, we can just do it without the rifling. We can put more types of ammo in there.
And T-72.
They weren't really sharing technology at that point.
True, but they were sharing a lot of ideas. There's a lot of cross-pollination going on there.
So they came up with the design, and the main thing for the Chieftain was firepower. Firepower was their first consideration. And back when they had the triangle of you could either have it cheap, fast, or good, whereas for tanks that triangle of capabilities is armoured protection, firepower, and mobility. And for the Chieftain, they said firepower first, then armoured protection, and then mobility. And how was the mobility on the tank after all that, John?
Poor.
Poor is a good word for
as was the protection. And, I mean, they obviously had an inkling that steel armour was about to be having a lot of trouble with high explosive anti-tank warheads in anti-tank missiles, and also the rise of the discarding sabot, basically firing an enormous dart that goes straight through steel armour. And even, the British knew that steel armour had problems because they invested so heavily in high explosive squashed head, such as used by Chieftain, where the shell sort of impacts the outside of the enemy tank and then forms what's called a blister on the other side of the armour. And the armour can be extremely thick, and the shockwave still forms a blister, and then there's bits of your own armour flying around the inside of your tank, which is extremely unpleasant for anything that survives it, which is nothing. So steel armour was very much at the end of the line, even for enormous thicknesses of it, and a lot of countries were having different ways of dealing with that at the time. The Germans with the Leopard 1 basically said, you know what, armour's overrated on tanks.
Which can make it faster.
And produced a tank that was, it could keep out 20mm cannons, but nothing bigger. And keeping out 20mm cannons is no small achievement either, but, and it was essentially a glass cannon, and everyone was thinking, is glass cannons the future of tanks? And, obviously then, just after Chieftain, the laminate armours really, and composite armours really started getting good, and actually able to keep out, discarding sabot penetrators and high explosive squashed head and high explosive anti-tank rounds. As we're seeing in Ukraine, they don't keep them out perfectly, and they're still vulnerable on the top. But it was a huge step up, and protection came back into vogue in tanks for a very long time and is still largely in vogue. But Chieftain was got stuck at a moment when the world changed, and that's going to come into a big part of why we're going to
now, what was the question you asked our fans about the Chieftain, John?
It was, is the Chieftain a really good tank?
Wow.
And on Twitter, 2/3 said it was, and we're going to. I think they were all English, and I have the only time I've really had a former tanker get angry with me online was a former Chieftain crewman who thought my views were obviously wrong because I'd never driven a tank myself. But I think he's wrong, and we're going to get into why.
Well, like with anything, there are depths and nuances as towards whether it was a good tank, whether it was capable, whether its mobility was good or bad. Anyway, let's go into some stats and figures for the Chieftain.
You don't want to talk about the engine, or we'll get to that?
We'll get to the engine
first
off. All right, so how many were built, John?
Oh, about 1,000, wasn't it?
2,000.
2,000. Oh, that's including the export market.
Yes, because the British made about 900 something for themselves. And then another 1,000 exported across, mainly to the Middle East, because they tried to sell some to the Israelis. They gave 2 to the Israelis for testing and evaluation, and then said, "Yeah, you know what? We're going to sell to everybody else besides you." So they sold them.
Yeah, and it is worth noting that the Israelis did actually feed a lot of their own thoughts on tank design back into the Chieftain project.
No, they kept that for themselves. That we figured that out. We read that in Macabre.
Major Tal.
No, they kept all that information because they wouldn't sell them the Chieftain.
Okay.
All right. So, how many tons is it, John? It's heavy.
It's heavy. It's like, isn't it 75 or something like that?
No, it's only 55.
Okay.
Up armoured and everything. It got up to about 65.
Okay. Yep. So heavy for the time.
Yes.
Not that heavy in.
First entered service in 1966 and. Left British service in 95, but is still going.
It was well out of frontline service by then, but yeah.
Yes, but it was still going even to this day. So there are countries in the world using Chieftains on the battlefield, and
mostly because they can't get anything else, though.
Some of them just upgraded them. So we'll get to their upgrades. Yep. 7.5 meters long on the hull. It's quite a long hull.
It's a big, impressive tank. When you see one, when you hear one, if it's running, it's an impressive piece of machinery. As we're going to discuss, there are some issues, but
3.6 meters wide, so normal standard width for a tank. Only 2.96 meters high. Now, why was it such a short tank for such a big tank?
Because they made the driver lie down.
They made the driver... This was a innovation, saying whereas all previous tanks had the driver sitting upright, which meant you had to have the hull much higher. So with the Chieftain, they made him lie... Well,
it's called supine position.
Or semi-reclined.
Like leaning like this.
Yes. And so they didn't need as much room for the driver's body to be able to lie down in the front of the tank. So they could lower the hull and angle it much more sharply on the front and lower glacis.
And I'll give it credit, as the end point largely of steel-hulled tank design, it probably has the most beautiful turret that was ever mounted on a tank. It's all curved and sloped and
lots of sloping,
scooped and scallops and everything taken out where possible. And if you look at a lot of science fiction tank designs coming out of the 1980s and 90s, which I'm really talking Japanese anime here, they all look a lot like Chieftain, don't they? People thought this was going to be the future, and then the future shifted really rapidly, which is where we're going to get to some of the difficulties.
All right, so we've talked about the 120mm rifle gun, which was the L11. L11
A5.
A5 tank gun. But at the beginning, it came out with 2 GPMGs, general purpose machine guns, mounted on it for the in coax and for the commander. But it also used to have a 50 cal spotting gun. So mounted above the barrel of the L11.
This is before laser designators became possible. They're like, what we'll do is we'll get a round to go out there and
Not
go
one,
ping.
But 3. You had to sit there and go ranging and bing, bing, bing. You said 3 50 cal rounds down the range or across the battlefield. And if you're in a tank on the other side and you hear something go tink, 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 you know,
reverse.
They've got you ranged in, and they
do something different. Whatever you're doing, change it.
They've got you ranged in, and the 120mm squash head will be coming in very quickly.
Can we go back to the 120mm gun briefly?
Yes.
This was a classic thing that the British had an absolute worldwide winner with the 105mm Royal Ordnance L7 gun.
Yep.
And everyone in the world had bought it. Even the Americans had grudgingly had to buy it. And you can imagine for the American army to choose to buy a British weapon, it's not something they do lightly. Everyone bought it. It was great. And they honestly thought that, well, if we just take that and spec it up to 120mm, it's going to be the future. And, of course, everyone else went, smoothbores, discarding sabos. And, the future, again, lurched off in a different direction to what they were expecting.
But the British have stuck to it, and they're going to stick to the guns, and they're still sticking to those guns.
Well, they're finally moving...
60 years later, they're going to stick to it.
Well, it got them stuck with they're the only ammunition supplier in the world who'd make 120mm rifled ammunition, and then having propped that up, they had to keep using it. It really took them down the wrong path for a long time.
I'm sure somebody got some really nice lunches out of that decision, though.
Oh, yeah. Probably some very nice cars as well.
All right. So eventually, it got up to about a 500k range on roads with the engine.
Which is a huge improvement over Centurion. You've got to give it that.
Yeah, which was 100k's, but yes. It could reach on roads up to 40 kilometres an hour, John. So very quick.
Could.
If
it ran at all.
But let's go into the engine, shall we? So, the Leyland engine.
Well, let's be fair at the start that the British very foolishly thought that when NATO made a requirement that all engines should be multi-fuel, that everyone meant it and was going to have to do it.
Now, we've been through this back in the 80s ourselves, playing, was it...
We Australia, playing Twilight 2000.
Twilight 2000, where you would say, multi-fuel, again, we've probably discussed this previously, multi-fuel is the way, if you, post-apocalyptic environment where you're the tank on the battlefield, you want to be able to run your tank with either petrol, diesel, kerosene, whatever's available, jet fuel, whatever.
Runs on vodka in the spring. Yep.
Whatever's available. And
that means you want a diesel.
And so that was the requirement that NATO had, is that yes, for that post World War III environment, you want a tank that can run on anything in order to try and maintain your empire after the fall, as it were.
Yeah.
And so they put this requirement in, and the British said, right, we're going to do this.
Well, and here's the thing: only one engine manufacturer in the world came back to this tender and said we can do it, and it was the Leyland Company.
Leyland.
And they are not the best.
No, they're a good British company. But they are
terrible engine makers.
They're not known.
Terrible car makers.
They are not Rolls-Royce. They are not.
Yeah.
They are not Merlin.
Yeah. So that was the start of the problems, really. Okay, moving on with the engine. So to begin with the problem, it's got a really bad specification. We'll get into why multi-fuel's a bad specification further. It's being built by Leyland, who are not a very good engine maker or anything maker. You do have a problem with British manufacturing in the 1960s in that the tax structure in Britain had really disincentivized them upgrading their machine tools. So all their factories were basically still using the machine tools they'd bought in the 1940s for World War II, and they were wearing out at that point.
And probably your shop union rules meant that...
That didn't help, but it was in particular that the machine tools were just wearing out, and that's why all the British motorcycles, all the British cars, everything the British built in this period industrially was using really old, worn-out machine tools, and that had some really deleterious effects. But in particular, Leyland had built this engine, and they come up with an idea that to get the multi-fuel going, you have to have different compression ratios when you've got diesel or petrol running.
Yes.
And a way to manage those different compression ratios is an opposed piston design. We talked about this with T64, where you've got two pistons in the chamber coming at either end, and that gives you more control over the pressure, which lets you choose between diesel or more conventional gasoline petrol. The reality, though, is that having to have crankshafts at either end of your engine and keeping the whole thing synchronized is incredibly complicated and difficult, and the Russians followed the British down this terrible pathway with the T-64.
Part of a cunning plan.
Well, certainly, Chieftain's main achievement was stuffing up the Russians with the T-64, but it gave them an incredibly complex engine that broke down an enormous amount of time, to the point on its first exercises, 90% of the Chieftains broke down from engine failure.
Yes.
90%. No enemy shooting at them. They just broke down on their own. That's worse than Panther.
Yeah.
It's worse than early Panther.
Yeah. So this is why the Mark ones that came out in 1966, 67 went straight from. They were so underpowered and so bad that they went straight from the production line into a training environment because they said, "Yep, we are never going to deploy these tanks on the battlefield because they're just not good enough. We can't do it." But they said, but we can use them for training because, well, we don't have to drive that far and there's always somebody who can repair them.
It's good practice to repair it.
It's good practice. It is very good practice. Now, the other thing with the engine, it actually
the
multi-fuel engine, it made it, well, actually made the opposed pistons actually made the tank longer. So where I was saying before, it was 7.5 meters long for the hull. An extra that was an extra 75 centimeters. So that was because they had to fit in this opposing piston engine in the rear of it. So because of all that, it made a longer tank. When of course with a longer tank, you've got a longer, wider turning circle, and just makes
more likely to lose the tracks once it gets past a certain length as well.
Yeah, and look, more grip on the ground, but you can lose tracks, and you've got a wider turning circle, and there are other issues with it.
Yeah. Now, having sacrificed so much to have this multi-fuel capability, it then turned out that to switch it from one fuel to another required at least 12 hours and a full troop of the Royal Engineers and a fully...
Electrical Mechanical Engineers, not the Royal Engineers.
Sorry, yes. And
REME rather than... Yeah.
Your old corps, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. And in the Australian Army, you should know.
Yes.
And it needed a fully equipped workshop, so this wasn't something you could just do at the front line saying, hey, we've only got diesel, let's switch the engine over with a flick of a switch. It would have been easier just to swap the engine out.
Which is what, I saw a number of comments saying how envious they were of the Leopards, where you could just come along, lift the power pack and the engine out with a fitter's crane and put a new one in, whereas with the Chieftain, it was 12 hours of hard work.
And they never used it. They never used the dual fuel capability ever.
No.
So it was a complete waste of time and effort.
Later versions were more reliable, but still not great. However, I want to say one thing on the engine here is that a number of comments I saw against YouTube videos. Now, whether or not there's any truth to this, but the people saying, yes, I was a driver of a Chieftain back in the 80s in Germany, yada, yada, yada. That mainly the failures actually came about from due to seals drying out on the engine. So seals basically a rubber gasket that stops oil and other fluids going from one metal section to another. They would fail because they would dry out because due to lack of usage and running time. Because if you're turning the engine over all the time, basically it keeps the fluids all moving, so it keeps those seals wet, and so they don't dry out and crack and become brittle, and then let various fluids go from one side of the tank to the other, the engine to the other. It shouldn't.
It is a basic requirement of an engine to keep the fluids and the bits they're meant to be in, though.
Yes, but obviously this is a cheap part that if you...
From the Leyland Corporation, you say.
But if you keep the engine going and do... and this was exacerbated by the distance to the training grounds in Germany and not being allowed to drive on the roads in Germany unless they were actually needed to.
Which is a predictable requirement, though. So
basically, they had to. So they were stationed in Germany during the Cold War, and so they weren't. It was too much effort to drive to the training areas where they could actually run around and do some training. So what they found was eventually they found that crews in Germany that kept their tanks moving on a more daily basis where they had fewer engine breakdowns, but it did mean that they were putting up the engine hours on the engine, which meant more servicing requirements on the engine, but it meant they also broke down less when actually required, and they were just driving around the base because that was the only place they could do it. So I don't know. I couldn't find anything describing any of this too, but as I said, a lot of anecdotal comments within YouTube and other places saying yes, when driven much more, the engines were much more reliable. So there you go. So you'd want to have that operational tempo going before you actually had to go into combat.
Yeah, which, to be fair, the M1 Abrams going to the first Gulf War had similar issues that got ironed out when people started doing scheduled maintenance because they were going to have to fight in it. I just want to quickly shout out to some listeners. Captain ACAB has joined us from Philadelphia. So I believe he doesn't like police with the name ACAB. All cops are bastards.
Never heard that one before.
Never heard of that, yes.
No.
Alan has figured out where the chat box is. Welcome, Alan. We're not going to respond to every comment, but we'll see how we go. And Okie Boy 5401 wants us to know that good engines are not needed. It just has to get there. What's
the famous quote? About the Chieftain, John?
It's the best tank in the world if it breaks down where you need to fight. But I'd also say that fundamentally at the heart of all good tanks is a good engine. I don't think we've, in all, this is episode 36, all the tanks we've talked about, there was a good one with a bad engine. It's the absolute, it's the power plant. It makes it move. It's the prerequisite. If it doesn't move, it's just a pillbox. So anyway, that's my view on the subject. Obviously, folks, we've got the poll running there. At the moment, it's... Oops. That was an exciting noise.
There was something behind the tanks on the screen.
Anyway, so it's the poll at the moment is leaning towards really bad tanks. So I'm glad that we're having some influence as we speak to you. Okay. Alan has a new cigar, by the way, as well. Okay.
Good on you, Alan.
Getting back to the Chieftain and its design.
Well, sloped armour. Very sloped armour on the front and front, upper and lower glasses.
I would say, to me, it felt like a design not out of T-54, T-55.
Yes.
Yeah, the Russians definitely got there first with that wide, low tank design and did it better, I would say, as well.
And because of the reclining driver position, they could achieve that, having that real... And there was even...
Whereas the Russians just went with really short drivers.
One way of doing it.
Yeah.
The Brits, but because of their very sharp slope, it increased the armour thickness, the effective armour thickness on any shots coming in from the flat on the front of the tank hugely. It went from like 2.5 inches to 15 inches of armour across that slope.
It did, but this is again where the world was changing as they were designing it. And
remember, this is the 60s.
Yeah, but this has happened to everyone. And Alan's mentioned Arjun, but we when we talked about Arjun, it was a classic case of it was just the design period was so long that the world had changed from when they started designing the tank to the end. And similarly, discarding Sabo anti-tank rounds don't care about the angle of the armour. Yeah, they don't deflect. They come in so fast. They just dig in.
And anti-tank missiles were, again, still not quite there yet.
Yeah. Although they were going to be there quite soon after it ended service.
Because of the secrecy of this highly sloped front glasses, they actually built a nice wooden box to go around the front of the tank. To cover it up so that nobody would be able to see how angled it is as they were driving around.
Albion is perfidious like this.
Sorry?
Albion is perfidious like this.
Albion? Oh,
yeah, perfidious Albion.
Yes, okay. Right, I hadn't heard that before, yes. But I was thinking it's a wooden box to cover the front of the tank so that nobody can see how sloped your armour is. Now, shall we mention the most famous chieftain of all, John?
Yeah.
For those who don't know, the most famous chieftain of all is the one that drives over Mr. Bean's car. His little Leyland Mini from 1982, I want to say. Sorry, I can't remember when he actually happened. So for those of you who are wondering what sort of tank drove over Mr. Bean's Mini in the show, Mr. Bean goes to the show or the parade or something like that. It was a Chieftain tank. Just crushes that poor little Leyland. So a Leyland crushing a Leyland. There you go. So I'd say that's the most famous chieftain out there. Anybody wants to tell us about a more famous chieftain?
I mean, there's the one that drives around at Bovington.
It's not like Tiger 131 where you don't even know its name, do it?
No, I guess not. No, it's Boudicca. There you go. I do know its name.
Oh, there you go. You've seen it? You've taken photos? Some of these photos are John's?
So, three of these are mine. Two of them are of a chieftain. One of them's a Tiger 2. Should we talk about why we have a picture of a Tiger 2 in the slideshow?
Tell us why you've got a Tiger 2 in the slideshow, John.
Okay, so as you might have noticed by my accent, I am in fact an Australian. But I do have...
Struth, mate.
Struth.
Really?
Crikey. I do have English family. My mother's English and I am a dual citizen. So I'm allowed to trash talk Chieftain. Just getting that out there. I'm invoking my UK passport privileges here. And so
and the plane hasn't even been hijacked.
Yeah, so in 2018, I went to on a holiday to the UK to see, well, mostly to see things, but I have family there, so I went to see them too. And my cousin Catherine, who's roughly the same age, she's much younger and more beautiful than me, said, if you're going to that tank museum, why don't you take Teddy, who at the time I think was 8 years old, her child. And it's kind of funny when you only see someone for a couple of days at a time over the space of 40 years that they'll just be like, have my child. But I guess when you're family, you just get that level of trust. And I also took...
Depends on the vibe in the family.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree.
I also took my Teddy's sister Isabella, who's in the picture you'll see with the king tiger. I didn't take a picture of the chieftain and the kids, that's why I've got that one in there. Anyway, the chieftain starts going around the track for the display bit of the afternoon, because when you go to Bovington Tank Museum, they bring... I think every day 3 tanks go around and do a couple of laps and everyone gathers for the show. And
goes, ooh, ah.
Yeah. Well, it's good to hear the engines.
Boom.
You hear the sounds and the smells of
diesel,
of tanks in motion. And Teddy is extremely precocious and asked me, is this a good tank? And I said, no, Teddy, it's a terrible tank. And I think it was David Wiley from the Tank Museum was on the tannoy, the PA that day. And he was like, oh, and it was a very good tank. And Teddy looked at me like I was a real piece of crap. I was like,
you just told me.
He says it was a very good tank, and I said it's got a terrible engine and it's got a lot of other problems. Anyway, so the war as to whether Chieftain was good or not started there.
There is a good video of David Wiley and a 4-year-old
Eli.
Eli.
Eli knows all about the problems of that engine,
and he's 4, so if he can figure it out. Great video. Good on you, Eli. Okay, but
yes.
There were a lot of tanks made, Chieftain tanks made, John. And
yeah.
Do you know what? And they weren't made that long ago, realistically.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know what happens with old tanks?
They end up in the Middle East?
That's the old tanks that get sold there. But the old tanks that didn't get sold there end up on the open market. And you can buy a non-moving Chieftain.
Well, they're all non-moving.
No, for £18,000 these days.
Wow.
Yeah, or you can get a running Chieftain with activated main gun Mark 10 for £50,000.
That's quite cheap.
Exactly.
If we sell some more T-shirts, redbubble.com, search Totally Tanks.
They are in England.
Yeah.
But again, there's some good...
You just pay... Oh, they don't fit in a shipping container, do they?
No.
I think they strap them on the top of the containers. Yeah.
But there's some good videos of people recovering and outfitting and doing up their Chieftains that they've purchased from one end of England and putting it on the back of a low loader and driving to the other end.
There's a lot of swearing involved in those videos, though.
And flat tyres and getting stopped by the police to have a look at it and being told, yes, you need to put some, this is Fit a Match, and his videos were quite, I enjoyed those. And then they'd go out for a tank day, just driving around stuff and knocking over trees and having fun. That was a good one.
Look, because I have been looking at the price of a universal carrier, and it sounds like, partly because they're road legal, them cost more than a whole Chieftain. A running one. Running one could nick us like $40,000.
Wow.
On the other hand, you can literally take it camping and drive it on the road and register it and things, which you're never going to do with one of these. So, yes, and more reasons why the universal carrier is better than a Chieftain.
All right. Now, the ammunition, John, for the 120mm gun. What was it?
Mostly Hesh was the British.
How many parts was it?
Now, we got in trouble with Challenger on this because the answer for Challenger is 2 and 3, depending on how you count them. So tell me how many parts in the Chieftain.
It is a 3-part ammunition. So, so you got the round itself.
Is that different from Challenger 2?
Probably not.
Yeah, okay.
So it's a 3-part ammunition whereby you've got the round itself, which is 50 centimetres long, and then you've got the charge, you whack in, shoving behind it. So they actually managed to simplify the gun by having a two-part ammunition, because where previously they had to have an automatic gun, round rammer that would then, once you put the round in, it would come in and push the round all the way in.
Yep.
By the loader, or operator as they're called, they could put the round in and then they put the charge in, and they'd use the charge to push the round all the way up the barrel into the breech. And then the third part is the detonator, basically.
Yes, and that's the bit that some people don't think is a third part. Why they say it's a two-part ammunition, but there is a part, and it's a third one.
And the loader / operator has to put that in order to make the gun go bang. But what they could do, because again, this is a 120mm gun with a person loading it, and of course, being two-part ammunition, they couldn't go to one part because it's just too big around to be lugging around.
The loader needs to be able to pick it up,
and shove it into the breech. By having two-part ammunition, they could have one round in the breech, and the loader could be sitting there with the next round in their lap.
Yeah.
So
hope you don't go have any big bumps, so you're losing your teeth. But yeah.
It's not that they didn't actually have a seat, so they'd be holding it in their lap essentially, but and ready to go for once the round was ejected. The gun went bang and things came out, and then he could shove the next round into the breech and get ready things. So it increased the speed of loading. But still, as I said, they had they figured out their tables of the loader can load this fast, or 6 rounds a minute, or whatever it was, for the first 10 minutes, and after that, the load speed of firing drops significantly as the loader gets fatigued.
Now, can we talk about the suspension?
Yes.
So, in a world that's using torsion bars and other exciting things, what do you think they went with?
Bogies.
Horseman suspension.
Yes.
Which was based on a car company that went bankrupt in the 1920s. And you got to admit it's reliable, and certainly in Centurion it worked well.
Took up less space within the hull.
It takes up almost no interior volume, so it has got that going for it. Quite similar to the American vertical volume system in the later model Shermans. But, you know, a dated, not even the most advanced suspension system in World War II, and you're building a tank in the 1960s, and you just bolted on the old Centurion suspension.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I guess given that it never moves, what's the suspension for? Why bother?
It moved.
Sometimes.
It went from the barracks in Germany down the road to where it broke down.
Yeah. And it was carried most of the way.
But we should talk about its operational deployment. So, this was, like the M60, it was a Cold War...
The British Army on the Rhine.
And it was the Cold War workhorse for the British in Germany. Now, John, I had to look it up before saying I went in looking for the Fulda Gap, because we've been talking about the Fulda Gap a lot. But
all tank fans dream of Fulda Gap.
Yeah. But the point being was that I kept saying, well, where's the British Army on the Rhine in this? Because it's all about these American divisions with their M60s and so forth. And when I started digging into it, they were in the north. They were on the North German Plain, which was another area significantly identified as a ingress for any cold Eastern Bloc countries to invade the West and cut off North Germany and Belgium and Holland and Denmark, and then cut everybody off from the North Sea and the English Channel as they came streaming across the plains of the North German Plain. Now, the difference with it was it was the European NATO forces were based upon to defend the North German plains. So that's your Brits, Germans, Belgium, and somebody else I can't remember, probably Netherlands. And it was designated as ideal tank ground. So what's the words? The North German Plain is good tank country, is the quote I have seen, given. So that was where they were expecting massed forces to come rumbling through, and everybody, and that's why the Brits and the with the Chieftain were given that area as their responsibility to stop any Eastern Bloc countries invading with masses of T-62s and T-72s through that area, and that was theirs to defend through this area. Whereas the Fulda Gap, which is further south, guarded by the Americans, was not nearly as good tank country, but was the most direct route into the west to cut Western forces off and influence their capabilities. So it was a very narrow area, and the Americans were given that to defend. And there was lots and lots and lots of plans here, there, and everywhere, and training and
nuclear landmines
and nuclear recoilless rifles.
Oh yeah, the Davy Crockett.
Yes, the Davy Crockett. I saw that and I went, I'm going to go down this rabbit hole. What the hell is this thing?
Where you had to fire it to maximum range, or the operator would be inside the fireball.
It had a range like 2 miles or something, and it had a radius.
Fireball of 1 mile. Yeah.
No, I think it was about 500 meters. So, but yeah, not long, not much, not much. And they had to use it as a low velocity recoilless rifle because you can't fire...
You don't want to break your nuclear weapon when you fire it.
Yeah, you can't fire nuclear weapons very fast. They have to go slow. Otherwise, as John says, they break and then it doesn't all happen. That was weird. Reading about the Davy Crockett and who had those deployed where, and goodness, that was crazy stuff.
Yep. Now, up in the slideshow, we have got the book Chieftains by, I think his name is Bob Forrest Webb, who's an interesting character. And when I was in high school hanging out at the Dixon Library, I noticed there was a book with a tank on the cover. So naturally, I borrowed the book and read it. And it probably wasn't aimed at a 14-year-old. But it made an impression at the time, and as a more realistic version of, say, Red Storm Rising, which is a little too happy ending, isn't this great? The Allies are going to win. It ends with nuclear fire raining down on the tank crew, but it has a fair bit of them fighting and using their tanks in North Germany in World War III. And in terms of apocalyptic fiction of the 1980s, it was very much of a piece where everyone's going to die. And it's quite funny in 2022 reading the Amazon reviews for this book, where an enormous number of readers are really angry that everyone dies at the end.
Well, that's what happens in World War III.
That is what World War III is all about. And it's I just found it really interesting, though, that modern readers don't actually have that comprehension of just how bad World War III was going to be.
Yeah. Saying, yes, nuke's going to go off in every...
End of the world as we know it,
Yes, it's not an asteroid from space, but it's the equivalent of.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about the crew. 4 people.
Okay, yeah.
Standard British crew.
Good modern tank crew, yeah.
The commander... yes, there's Ian. Mm-hmm. Just to come in and make her obligatory statement saying, I am here. The design within inside the tank, of course, being an English tank, it did have the boiling vessel, which it was very. There was no heater though, which is a strange thing to not have in a tank designed for Northern Europe.
No boiling vessel?
No, it had a boiling vessel. It didn't have a heater though.
Oh well, then I just meant to wear more jumpers.
Yeah. And the driver, who was all by himself down in the front of the tank, got very cold.
Lying down.
Yes, he got very cold. That was. I've heard tell it was called the refrigerator. The commander would sit behind the gun, so basically you had a 3-person turret with the loader, gunner, and commander, but he would sit right behind the gun, so he could have good visibility down the actual see where the gun is pointing, and being able to and not take up as much room of the gunner's space as some other tanks where they would have the commander directly behind. So the ergonomics within inside the turret were quite good. As good as any tank at the time, really.
I mean, it looked like the inside of the Millennium Falcon. With the pictures I've seen of a Chieftain powered up, there's an enormous number of lights and switches and complicated things to operate, which... again, this is a tank designed for professional army, not for conscripts.
And we'll get to what happens when you do throw non-professional armour people into this tank when we get to...
I don't think crew quality has that much to do with a T-72 round just going straight through it.
Yeah, it's a question of how you get there, though.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. We'll get to that, who's using it and what they've got.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, no, so you've got a 4-person crew. Anything else we want to say about them? No.
I mean, it's a traditional layout. I mean, it's fascinating that the boiling vessel is only just coming into American tank design. Because, yes, you know, we have talked about this in past episodes, but the British did their evaluations after World War II and realised that something like 30% of tank crew deaths were caused by leaving the tank to boil water to make cups of tea. And the solution to this was to basically put an electric kettle inside the tank. And yes, you can use that to make tea, and we can laugh, ha ha ha, very British making tea. But you can also use it to heat up water to have a sponge bath or make soup.
Cook your rations.
Yeah. And it is a tiny little thing that causes no trouble at all to the inside of the tank that massively...
Just an electric plug in and move it around within the tank. And tank crew comfort is very important. And particularly in your hyper-modern war where nuclear, biological, chemical weapons are likely, anything you can do to keep the tank, the crew safely buttoned up for longer is increasing the value of the whole vehicle. And how many different marks of the tank were there, John?
I went to 11, did it?
They turned up to 11. That's right. That's exactly right.
Spinal tap jokes.
They turned it up to 11. I don't even know if anybody had a cricket bat in there. So yes, 1 through 1 and 2 were dodgy as hell. 3 started getting to the point where they could actually export it, and then Mark 5 became the standard in the 70s. And so all other tanks, besides the Mark 1s, which are only used for training, were brought up to the Mark 5 standard. And from there, they increased... all other tanks were brought up to the Mark 5 standard, and that became what all the Chieftain was. And then from there, they exported a number of them, built a number of them, and all other changes from that point were mainly cosmetic and or better radios, better the laser rangefinders and other bits and pieces. They did have an early version...
So just quickly on that, because obviously the things you learn when you're in high school you tend to take through life with you. And because of the use of the ranging machine gun at this one little moment in the 1960s, I honestly thought ranging machine guns were the norm in tank rangefinding. Up until basically I started doing this podcast, I was like, oh no, they were hardly ever used by anyone.
But they were around for that. I mean, that was the idea for them for quite a long time. I mean, even the Australian Leopard 1s had a spotting round in it.
Yeah, but it's no substitute. The coaxial machine gun in most tanks is just for hosing down infantry. It's not for spotting.
Well, the thing is, a coax can be moved around, whereas usually
the spotting one has to be dialed in.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, if you're changing the round, you need the spotting gun to flick to a different position as well.
I was getting on with the early versions of composite armour added to the Chieftains in the 80s. This was called Stillbrew Passive non-explosive armour.
Yeah, this is the people who try and tell me that Chieftain was actually a good tank. Like, if you get to the version where they ripped out the bad engine, put a better engine in, and gave it the Stillbrew armour.
This is from 85.
Then it was actually not a bad tank, and it was like, yeah, but Challenger was on its way at this point.
Yes.
It was at the end of the road.
And which is why they didn't go into Marks 12 and 13, because they said, well, we could upgrade the Chieftain again, or we could just start... in fact, it was the Challenger 2 design they were going into at that point. So they said, look, we're not bothering to... because Challenger 1 was already around, they're not going to bother upgrading the Chieftain any further. They're going to go straight into the design for Challenger 2, because it was built to have composite armour, whereas everything with the Chieftain was they're adding on the composite armour after the fact, and so it wasn't built, designed, or engineered to have it on it. So, which is why...
And Stillbrew armour, I suppose that Major Still and...
Yes, 2 people put together, one called Still, one called Brew, or something like that.
Yeah. Was still nowhere near as good as proper composite armour. It was
So
it was rubber with
steel and rubber plates added to the turret. It was effective versus heat and HESH, but not APD.
more effective than not having it, but still not as effective as proper composite armour. Which let's remember the Russians introduced in the 1960s. But
So, but not effective against APFSDS,
which is a bit of a problem when that's the most likely thing to be fired at you.
Yes. And replaced by chop armor, which went on the challenges. So no further upgrades to the Chieftain. Now, who are I gotta say, Chieftains did not make it to Gulf War One in the British Army. They were in there, and other people's armies.
In the Kuwaiti army, in particular,
and even the Iraqi army.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But they did make it there on the British hands. And I've got to say, think about that. If you were a British chieftain crew going into a desert war where you knew, and alongside your American allies, and you knew that the opposition forces also had chieftain tanks, how would you feel?
You'd feel like the Americans were about to bomb you.
Which is, I'm sure they're very glad they did not take the
I would say that is exactly why the chieftain units were not sent to the Gulf.
Which is why the chieftain units were not sent to the Gulf, and it was the challenges that went to Gulf War One.
Yeah, I would also say though that the British we'll get to the Iran-Iraq war, but the British paid the Iraqis in that war a lot of money to get accurate data on what the Iraqi T-72s were doing to the Iranian chieftains. And so they would have known well that the chieftain was in no way up to conflict in the Gulf.
Modern conflict.
Not even particularly modern conflict, just Gulf conflict.
All right, so we've gone through who we've sold tanks to. So we've got the Middle East. So while the British luckily never had to use the Chieftain in anger because, again, as I say, it was a Cold War workhorse where it would be, it was there to defend the West versus the Eastern Bloc countries invading with masses and masses of T-62s and T-72s and everything else in between. Luckily enough, it never had to carry out those actions. Whereas the other countries that it was shipped off to in the Middle East, and there's 1,000 of them, did do a lot of fighting and not of it all terribly good. So, approximately 1,000 sold to various other countries from 1970 to 1995.
Let's talk about British exports to the Gulf, though. They rarely actually reflect anyone in the Gulf saying this is a good tank, this is the thing we need to have. It has a lot more to do with saying we want access to British financial services, or we want to be able to... It's got a widget. Mm-hmm. Or say, beer reviews coming, folks. Or saying that, we want to buy real estate in London because... one thing you might know if you've spent any time in London in the summer is that it's much more pleasant than Riyadh or Jeddah. So a lot of people from the Gulf holiday in the UK during the summer just to get to somewhere that's livable in those conditions.
Whereas Londoners get out of London.
Yeah, they go to Spain. But having been poor in London, I used to stay in there through the summer. So just because Arab countries buy, or Iranians aren't Arab, but Gulf countries buy... let's say Gulf. Let's say Gulf countries buy British tanks for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the tank and lots of other factors, and the people making the decision to buy the tanks are never the ones who are going to have to go and fight and die in them, so they just really don't care too much. And that's an important thing to remember with the enormously popular sales of this tank to the Middle East and the Gulf. And we have got a slide of showing all the operators. It's not on right now, Rob. It'll come up in a minute.
It's the I've seen it from Red versus Blue. But anyway, so before they had the major sales to the Middle Eastern countries. We've said previously the British did provide 2 to the Israeli Defence Force for evaluation and testing in the 60s, but those sales did not go through in 1969. But from 1970 onwards, they provided 274 tanks to Jordan. Who also got to get another 90 from Iraq during the Gulf War, who got them from Iran and Kuwait. So again, they're swapping hands all left, right, and centre, and some of those, Jordan still has a number of chieftains still in use. Iran, prior to the revolution, got over 700 chieftains, so they were the major export market for the British. To the Shah, and they had more on the way, which was going to be the upgraded versions, which essentially became the Challenger 1.
We talked about this in the Challenger episode, but essentially when the British got to the end of the road with all their tanks and said, what the hell are we going to do, they turned around and said, oh, hang on, we've already developed this tank for the Iranians, and it was essentially Challenger.
And there are a number of issues here with the Iranians, with the fall of the Shah in 79 and the Islamic Republic rising, there were no further sales from Britain. However, they had put down a quite good deal of money for the purchase of their new Chieftain / Challenger tanks, and when they came into power, when the Revolutionary Guard came into power, they said, well, can we have our money back, please? And the British said, no.
No, we're giving that to the Shah, or the Shah's family. Yeah.
So we're not giving you money back. And the Iranians are saying, well, what about the tanks? We're saying, well, they're not giving you the tanks either. So it was a fun little thing of, and it's still a contentious issue to this day of, well, our government of the day gave you money, and you did not provide the contracted services for which we paid. So
give us our money back.
Give us our money back.
And I would say I'm not a fan of Islamic revolution per se, or Islamic extremism. I'm not a fan of anyone's religious extremism.
No. Any sort of...
But I would say the Shah's regime was a murderous, heavily prone to torture and death squads regime that turned...
So anything that's influenced by the CIA is what you say.
Yeah, but, the Iranian people who, I imagine most of our listeners have met a couple of Iranians in their lives, are,
they're people.
Intelligent, creative people just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And
don't want to have their lives ruled and maintained by some religious ideologue who's telling them everything they have to do.
Yeah,
they just want to live their lives.
But backed into the corner by the Shah's regime, Islamic revolution seemed like a better option, and they were probably right.
Yes.
Be nice to Iran, is I guess what I'm saying.
I was about to say, there are religious extremists everywhere, and they are not good people, whereas people are people, mobs are mobs.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, that was Jordan and Iran. Oman was bought 27 chieftains. And
that's a real token let us into London move, isn't it?
Theirs are still in use as well. Back then, the countries we call Yemen, Oman, and were the British tropical Gulf states, I think it's called. My folks have got an old map, and they're all one area, and I think it's the British Gulf states or something like that. So before, so this is old maps. It's still up on the wall. Kuwait bought 340 chieftains all up.
And when the Iraqis invaded, they hightailed it out of Iraq.
Most of them hightailed it out of Iraq.
And they didn't break down, so I'm guessing they were ones with non-Leyland engines. But
a lot of these tanks, just remember, they have been upgraded a great deal by the countries that have them in use. And as I say, still have them in use, and they've been tropicalized, and they have air conditioning, they have sand filters, they have all sorts of things in them that make them still effective in that environment. So the countries, they're buying these tanks and they're using them, and as John's saying, It's probably more for the other markets that and offsetting British oil purchases from those countries in order to make them feel good about how much money the British government is spending on their oil versus what they're reducing the trade deficit between them.
I'd just note that no country that didn't have international oil sales that they wanted to run through London markets ever bought Chieftain. It's a complete overlapping circle.
I'm not going to disagree.
Yeah.
All right. Now, and the other country who didn't buy any chieftains, but did still operate them, was Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
So they captured 90 from Iran and then Kuwait during the first proper Iran-Iraq war, which is from 1980 to 1988, and then they captured some more from Kuwait in 1990 when they invaded there. So, lots of people using chieftains in that little small area that none of them were British.
Yes.
Now, I think, John, we take a small break here and come back for...
Oh, we're going to come back for beer review. Okay, break time. Here we go. All right, folks, we're back.
Now, what are we drinking today, John?
Sorry, Rob, what's the time for?
Beer review!
This ain't no grog or ale. 1 pint down, you'll be swinging in the gale. 5 pints, buddy, you'll be shaking in your shoes.
Okay. You bought it, you tell me.
It is Young's. It is British, well, English, whatever, London. London will always be Young's, established in 1831. Double chocolate stout. Natural British crafted, deliciously rich. Now, that is a, very dark chocolatey stout.
Yes, and it's got a widget in it.
It's got a widget in it.
It's got a widget. It has got... Sorry, that's... Anyway.
The song of his youth.
Yeah, 1990s English TV advertising there. It's deliciously rich, it says. And, a nitrogenated... Sorry, okay, a widget. So there's a little plastic... You can hear that rattling around in there. A little plastic ball, and it's full of nitrogen, and when the pressure on the can is released, it opens up and floods your beer with nitrogen, which gives the lovely little tiny bubbles and the soft mouthfeel. It's entirely artificial. There is no natural brewing process that will put nitrogen into your beer, but people decided they like it. So here we go. This is brewed with real chocolate and natural chocolate flavour added. So I'm not sure, you could just say brewed with real chocolate. I feel that's a lot of words to say the same thing. Natural British...
That's how you get the double chocolate stout. By having the chocolate and the natural...
And the chocolate flavour, which is a natural chocolate flavour, but isn't chocolate.
Yeah, but it's added.
Yeah.
So he's got two of it.
I have my doubts about what the hell natural chocolate flavour is that isn't chocolate. Yeah. Okay.
It's got a goat on it. It's got London on it.
It does. And one thing I would say about London beers is the traditional London yeast strains are amazing, and I use them in my own home brewing all the time. London beer doesn't have a huge reputation worldwide. It's not like other towns that have better reputations, and that's, I think, partly because they're always skimping on the ingredients, and the water is
dirty.
Yeah, it's recycled. You're just drinking someone else's wee when you're drinking London water. But which does make your boobs bigger, but for everyone. Because the estrogen doesn't get taken out. Yeah. Okay, having said that, it's this is a lovely stout.
It's 500 mils, 5.2%. It's not cheap. $9 something a can.
Oof.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, so you can get most of a case for the four that I bought.
Yeah, right. It is chocolatey though.
It is chocolatey. I'm finding it has a bit of a watery starting taste, and it's only the taste on the tongue, the chocolate and the stout actually comes in at the end. But maybe that's just my poor burnt out taste buds. But it doesn't have a lot of flavour. Right when it hits your lips, it's when it hits the back of your throat.
I would say 5.2% alcohol is on the low side for a stout.
It is,
and that's probably part of why it doesn't have the same mouthfeel as the bigger lads. It does in very small print on the side. If you look for it, say, warning, this can contains a pressurised insert. I wish I'd known that before I tried to open it, as did you with your little disaster. But some widgets just go berserk and you spray beer everywhere if you don't very quickly pour them into your glass. They seem to have cut the power down on this one which makes it much easier to control. And less likely to spray beer all over your house. So I applaud that innovation in widget design.
Yeah, you definitely cannot see through this chocolatey stout.
No, we got a ring light up there, and nothing's getting through that.
That is black light.
Absence of light.
I was about to say Vanta Black.
So yeah, it's I don't know if I'd pay $9 a can for it often.
No.
So
but guess what? We're going to drink it today.
Oh yeah, at a lower price, I'd say this is a fantastic little stout. Any stout, a stout is not a session beer. It's not a beer you drink all night long.
No.
But as something at the start of the night or towards the end when someone's being a bit of an idiot, this beer would fit in fantastically.
I'm always going to lean back to the Sinha chocolate stout from Sri Lanka that we had, and that has set the bar very high for my expectations.
That was a stout we reviewed in a rugby podcast 15 years ago.
It was,
yeah.
It was not cheap either, but it was.
Yeah. That was a very Sinha from Sri Lanka. The stout is astonishingly great, and you're going to love it if you get some.
But yes, we haven't done any Sri Lankan tanks, so we haven't done it.
No, I think we'll be waiting a long time for a Sri Lankan tank.
I think we will.
They're struggling to grow crops at the moment.
It's cool buggers,
and agricultural surplus comes first, then comes tanks. A lot further down the line, but
it's a messy
one
situation.
than the other.
Yeah. Still, they might end up eating the rich, which might spur on the rest of the world.
Yeah, look, they've driven the Rajapaksa family out of Sri Lanka, and that's a good precursor to doing better things. Yeah.
But if they start running out of food, they can always eat the rich. It's what's going to happen to the poor bugger.
Okay.
Not that we're advocating...
Captain ACAB, that one's for you.
Not that we're advocating cannibalism. That is not the case.
Yeah. All right. Now, I just want to talk about, in the Iran-Iraq War, you're going to talk about Operation Nasser, which was
victory.
The biggest tank battle of the Iran-Iraq War, which was a very significant...
Probably the biggest... Ooh, no, hang on.
75 Easting was like the biggest.
No, sorry, I was about to say until we had to Gulf War 1.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
As we noted, the British started paying the Iraqis to give them battle damage reports on how the chieftains were going. I think the British were kind of hoping, tell us how great the chieftains are. And the Iraqis like, no. So the Iraqis had T-72s. They were fighting the Iranian chieftains.
T-62. So you got the 125s and 115 guns.
But it was particularly the 125 discarding Sabo rounds in the T-72s that the Iraqis noted were just going straight through the glasses plate of the Iranian chieftains.
No, the turret, not the glasses.
They were going straight through them and out the back.
I think they were going straight through all the pictures I saw was straight through the front of the turret, which should be really, really, really heavily armoured, but it was going straight through the really heavily armoured sloped turret.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, point was, the T-72 rounds were going all the way through. I mean, it is bad enough to be penetrated on one side, and it doesn't really matter if you penetrate it on the other side because the first penetration kills everyone inside. But for the round to be going...
Sometimes it just goes in and out and nobody notices. What was that? We've got some new ventilation inside the tank.
I reckon if a 125 goes through your tank, you notice. Because the oxygen flashes to boiling point and all sorts of horrible things. And famously, the Iraqi director of armour was telephoned by the British saying, "Are you sure you don't want to buy some of our chieftains?" And his response was, "We don't want your stupid tanks." And then the Iraqi general of the Republican Guard said...
Iranian.
No, the Iraqi Republican Guard.
Oh, sorry. The Revolutionary versus Republican.
Yes.
Sorry.
Anyway, he said the 16th Iranian Armoured Division, which was was equipped with Chieftain tanks, lost a battle against the 10th Iraqi Armoured Brigade with T-72s. It is hard for an armoured brigade to destroy a division in 12 hours, but it happened. So for a brigade to destroy a division in 12 hours, I mean, hold up a division, force a division to retreat.
I'm assuming that was all happening at the Battle of Nasser, whereby essentially there were three Iranian Iraqi brigades there, but probably one of them was actually doing all the shooting, and the other two were just in reserve or waiting for them to break out or whatever else against three other Iranian. This is going to get complicated. Iranian armored divisions.
It would really help if those countries had different sounding names.
Exactly.
Yeah. How dare they?
What was it in? Yes, Prime Minister, where they were having some sort of formal event where they're going to have the Iraqis, Iranians sitting next to each other and throw the Irish into the same pew at the same time and say, don't do things alphabetically when doing political activities.
Look, I would say that even Middle East experts I've heard mix and transpose Iraq and Iran, which is incredibly problematic. But
revolutionary Guard versus Republican Guard.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, so Op Nasser, Operation Victory in January 1981. Okay, so just to give it some precursor, the Iraqis had invaded Iran in November 1980. They had basically spearheaded into the country and taken a number of, taken and or besieged a number of cities and areas, and were and then had stopped. The Iran had just gone through a revolution, had purged their military, and did not have a lot of general staff who had either been purged and or fled the country. You also had competing aspects within the military of the Revolutionary Guard, who were basically the Islamic fanatics who had been come up and formed the new military within Iran.
I mean, it's worth noting that your Revolutionary Guard are the ones who were getting tortured by the ruling regime right up until they won. They were the real hardcore headbangers who were doing the hard work and, had to be respected by the incoming regime because they were essentially, their real muscle.
So you had the regular and then you had the regular army. So there was a split between the two within Iran of the regular army and the Revolutionary Guard, where one was headed by the new government and with the president and prime minister and cabinet and everything else, and the other one was headed by the religious forces, essentially. The president decided that after a lot of toing and froing and Iran being very slow to react to the Iraqi invasion, the words are getting really mixed up. They were able to stop their advances by using their air force, but the president of Iran decided to take personal control of the Iranian army. Personal control. He basically stepped in. Nice. He stepped in and said, right, I am now in charge personally of the army. And he was going to lead 3 tank brigades on this attack in order to force out the Iraqi invaders. And it was a cluster. There was a lot of tension between the Revolutionary Guard and the regular army because the regular army was seen as being puppets of the Shah and the old regime and everything else that went along with that. The president came up with a plan that needed surprise.
Anytime the president comes up with a military plan, it's a worry.
I know, but he was saying he's come up with his plan. He's saying, I'm going to basically rebuild the military, the regular army, as a force to win this and achieve a victory, which is why it's called Operation Victory, Operation Nasser. He needed total surprise, and he needed mechanized infantry to achieve it. He had neither. So a lot of the mechanized infantry were either on holidays or conscripts who hadn't returned to duty because everybody was joining the Revolutionary Guard, and so he didn't have as much infantry as he would like for his 3 tank brigades that were going to be marching along to smash the Oinks.
I would say I have some sympathy for the Iranians saying, well, we've got our high-tech British tanks. Let's...
and M60s. It wasn't just Chieftains. It was so it was...
high-tech Western tanks. Of course they're going to do really well. And at the same time, the Tomcats in Iranian use were just blatting the Iraqi Air Force out of the sky. The Iraqis just had no capacity to even sense there was a Tomcat in the sky before the Phoenix missiles were just... undetected, obliterating them.
It was the Iranian Air Force that was basically stopped the invasion, and it was this counterattack that was coming from the tanks.
Sure, but it's really unfortunate for the Iranians that their high tech Western tanks were garbage, while their high tech Western airplanes were actually performing extremely well.
And they were coming up to this point. I mean, Iran prior to the fall of the Shah was the 5th most powerful army military in the world, or something like that. On paper. As with anything, it's on paper. But they had a lot of tanks. They had a lot of military. They had a lot of planes.
I'm pretty sure your dad went to a lot of training courses that had Iranians on it, just like my dad did, and they had a pretty low opinion of what they were dealing with there.
Probably, yes, probably. And so they have these 3 Iranian tank brigades have advanced on the enemy, expecting total surprise. And guess what? They did not get total surprise. The Iraqis knew they were coming, put a screening force forward, and they had total reconnaissance of what was coming for them. Put a screening force forward, engaged it, and then ran away. Cunningly ran away, and the Iranians advanced along a single road. 330 tanks advancing along a single road after crossing a pontoon bridge, and there was mud on either side of the road, so they could only drive down the road. Their mechanised infantry...
if this works, you're daring and swashbuckling, and you're a genius. And if it doesn't work, then it's not good.
There are lamp posts and ropes in your future.
Yeah.
But as it was, so they've crossed this pontoon bridge with 330 tanks driving towards this Iraqi force that is besieging a town. They've left their mechanised infantry on the far side of the pontoon bridge because there are 330 tanks in front of them, driving down this single road with mud on either side that they cannot cross, cannot manoeuvre around. And they've engaged with a screening force of Iraqi tanks who have then...
They need to get the first one.
the Iraqi tanks have suddenly reversed away, saying, "Oh no, we can't take you on," and
come further, come a little further.
Which is exactly what happened. And as they've come into the nice 3-sided box ambush that the Iraqis had set up with their T-72s and T-62s, they wiped out. And they had a shooting gallery in front of them, whereby the chieftains and the M60s of the Iranians who just got absolutely smashed. So, and then the Iraqis blew up the pontoon bridge behind all these tanks, so they couldn't retreat either. So it was like the Indians and the Pakistanis and the big battle. It was a case of knowing the ground and fighting the ground as well as everything else, and just don't get stuck in a bog. Watch out for the poplars, John. Watch out for the poplars.
Birch trees.
Birch trees, sorry.
Birch trees. Poplars are fine.
Yeah,
birch are the
trees.
problem.
Yeah, so...
I would say, this sort of comes back to the whole... it's kind of anti-tank podcast thing, but, in our second episode on the T-72, it was noted a CIA evaluation that said, no one questions the quality of the horses at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And similarly, the quality of the tanks, does it actually matter that much? If you use the tanks badly, bad things will happen. If you use the tanks well, good things will happen, assuming the tank is up to a certain standard.
But this is 1981, so there are anti-tank guided missiles out there at this stage. And
also just enormous 125mm discarding Sabo rounds in the T-72s.
Yeah, so the Iraqis did have 350 of their own tanks, as I was saying before. It was only a third of those are actually engaging, but even their mechanised infantry with the anti-tank guided missiles and everything else they had available to them were firing from hull down positions to an enemy who was stuck unable to manoeuvre in front of them, and it was just a slaughter of tanks, most of which were Chieftains. So the Iranians lost 214 tanks and lots of other stuff. And the outcome, of course, was there wasn't any lampposts and ropes, but the Iranian president said, you know what, I'm going to... he and a Air Force officer disguised themselves, took a plane and flew the hell out of there and fled the country. And so that was really the transition from a government-controlled military to a religious controlled Revolutionary Guard controlled military. So he was trying to get the regular army back into public standing within the country, and it failed. And this was the downfall, and it was all the chieftain's fault.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, Iran still has fountains that run red, commemorating what they call the blood of the martyrs, and they literally poured millions of young men into the Iraqis to slow them down, and you know,
it was an 8-year war.
But
there was nerve gas. There was all sorts of horrible things happening in that war. I haven't really read much about it.
I mean, the old joke about, you know, the Iraqis being like, how do you know they've got weapons of mass destruction? Well, we kept the receipts. When we sold them to them.
I was about to say, when reading about Op-Nassar, I kept thinking to myself, okay, the Shah's just fallen. It's a Islamic revolutionary government there in Iran. Saddam Hussein is a power-mad dictator, essentially. Why wouldn't the CIA buddy step in there and say, hey, do you want to go invade these guys, and here's lots of money to do it? Even though he was buying his tanks from the Russians rather than the Americans. But
yeah,
I don't know enough about it to be able to say confidently one way or the other, but at first glance, that's exactly what I would have said was happening there, is that the CIA was using a proxy to overthrow another revolutionary country.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a big fan of the Radio War Nerd podcast, and one of the points they've made is that very few to no one ever fights a war because they're pro-American or anti-American. They fight a war because they have local issues with local people, and if they can use that to get aid from the Americans and get lots of weapons and money, then they will do that. But that doesn't actually mean that they love America.
No. And let's face it, Iran had nationalised the oil within the country from the British and American oil companies. The Iran, that was huge. That was huge money for them. They just lost.
It was huge money, but the Iran hostage crisis definitely played a part in American antagonism towards Iran, even aside from the money.
Yes.
You know, and the humiliation of, what was it, Operation Eagle Claw?
Something like that. Yeah.
So it gets complicated, but it's also very, when you look back with a little bit of perspective, it's very Orwellian. You know, we've always been at war with Eurasia. No, we've always been at war with East Asia. You know, our rulers tell us who we're supposed to hate this week, and it doesn't make a lot of sense over the distance of time. But that's probably, yes.
That was probably the biggest battle the chieftain tanks have been involved with. The other one is the Battle of the Bridges in 1990, when Iraq invades Kuwait. So this is the other big one. Even though there were heightened tensions within the situation in 1990, the Kuwaiti forces had decided, well, we're not going to up our operational tempo just in case anything happens. We're just going to, the 2nd of August, when the invasion starts, it happens to be an Islamic holiday, basically New Year and all sorts of other events, just like here, if you invaded Australia on Boxing Day, you'll be stuffed.
Yeah. The classic line from many a British staff college, you know, next time we invade before breakfast.
Anyway, so it was the 2nd of August 1990. It was a lot of people were on, a lot of troops were on leave when at midnight on that night, the Iraqis started coming out across the border. The Kuwaiti troops saw, heard, got notified, and started gearing up their chieftains to defend Kuwait as these Iraqi tanks were invading down upon them. They managed by 6 o'clock in the morning. They had managed to get, having been alerted at 10 o'clock the night before, as things were happening, and then the invasion started at midnight. By 6 o'clock in the morning, they had managed to get 36 chieftains up and going. They still hadn't managed to fully arm them, but they'd cobbled them together from who was there, and then they went out to defend a number of bridges that cross into Kuwait, and there are great big highways, very wide highways leading into Kuwait and the areas there.
Still good positions to be able to dial in and know the range and just wait until the opposing piece of hardware crosses your threshold.
Basically, they'd gotten themselves into a good enough position by 6 o'clock in the morning that they were waiting for the Iraqi forces to come along. Now, the Iraqi forces had made a choice. The general of the invading Iraqi forces had made a choice. He said, "Look, I quite like the Kuwaitis. They're good people. I don't want to blow up all their stuff and kill a bunch of them. I don't want to hurt them. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to lead my attack with an artillery barrage. So no artillery
and no air power."
And no air power and tankers. Look, I don't want to hurt them, so
just push across the bridges. See
no.
what happens.
I want you to fire high explosive only, so no anti-tank.
So we don't kill them.
Yeah, just scare them. Just scare them so that they run away and we don't hurt them. So, and seriously, that's what they did. The Kuwaitis, on the other hand, said, "Yeah, we're loading up the squash head."
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and these 36 chieftains were able to. Not only they lined up to cover these bridges, and they were able to take out the Iraqis were just driving down in column, hadn't even deployed. Even when they got contacted, they did not deploy. The Kuwaitis were able to take out a number of tanks, and then they thought they had reinforcements coming along the road from their west, from their base, and as the tanks started driving in front of their position, they realised, hang on a second, those aren't more chieftains, those are more T-55s and T-62s.
72s, but yeah.
Yeah, and T-72s. Those are more Iraqi tanks coming from the direction of our base, and started lighting them up. And they then turned around and retreated, and we don't know how many Iraqi tanks were destroyed at the Battle of the Bridges. There are estimates over 30.
I don't have a lot of faith in Kuwaiti reporting. I don't have a lot of faith in Iraqi reporting. So
from the 5 minutes of Googling that I did, I did not
5 minutes, Rob.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Look at you.
There are certain things that drag me in, like the Davy Crockett. Anyway,
yeah, whole 5 minutes.
And then once the Kuwaitis ran out of rounds, they said, "You know what? Bugger this for a game of horses," and then drove to the Saudi border, and their chieftains got them there. So that's why.
Which is why I'm sure they were not Leyland engines in them. But,
No, there's lots of upgrades, and so that's the main combat experience of the Chieftain. So again, nothing in British service, quite a bit in Middle Eastern service of other countries of varying quality.
They did live on in a bunch of recovery vehicles and engineering vehicles, which we've had in the slideshow that way.
Which has made it to the Falklands.
Yes, it was the only tank in the Falklands.
Yeah, beach armour recovery vehicle.
Yes. Okay, so that's the Chieftain.
Has anybody got comments, questions for us about the Chieftain?
No, I mean, they've been burbling away there, thanks guys, but nothing we particularly need to reply to, so we're doing okay. At this point, we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Taiwan.
Yes, because there's been some burblings of things happening of those in Canberra here.
Yep, so I'm going to change, boom. There you go. We got some maps. Maps are important.
Did it again. Yes. I don't know what is behind the green screen. There's these tanks behind me.
It's a little plate with some plastic tanks on it.
I should not.
You're tank bashing. Okay. So Taiwan looks like it's seriously hotting up, and Lord help us that it doesn't go off, because we're nerds, and none of us will be able to buy PlayStation 5s if this war goes off. This is how serious it is. And I say that jokingly, but the whole semiconductor industry is revolves around trade between China and Taiwan. I did love the U.S. Congress instructed the Navy just, I think, in the last 2 weeks to make sure they buy more American parts and American-made parts. And you can imagine the Navy saying, you've had 70 years of your choices about industrial production and forcing it out of the country. And now we're meant to make that good. Anyway, Taiwan. As you can see...
25 million people in a very small island.
Yes, let's do a little bit of brief Chinese history here, though. And because literally, I think the British Foreign Minister dared to tweet in the last month that, the Chinese are a bit touchy about their sovereignty. 2 centuries of humiliation, including multiple opium wars in which mostly the British, but in general the West, fought wars to force the Chinese to let opium run through their streets and mess up their people.
Western countries were clambering to get involved in those wars, and so that they
could... To steal more of China and more Chinese money and exploit Chinese people.
Yeah. They were saying they were literally the Russians and the Germans and everybody else was clambering, saying, "I need to be part of this. I need to get build my empire and get some of the silver that was coming out of China," and saying, "Yes, this is where my opportunity. I'm going to make big on this by being part of this defending this area." And so forth.
Yeah. Now, in this slideshow, there is a building with lots of circular windows. Let's come up there a minute, Rob. It's okay. And this is Jardine House, which is built by the bank Jardine Matheson, which made their fortune in the Opium Wars. And they built this enormous skyscraper in Hong Kong with these round windows. And it is my pleasure to report that it is widely known to the locals in Hong Kong as the House of 1,000 Arseholes. And that's not something you get to put in a tank podcast every day, but it is highly relevant because if this war kicks off over Taiwan, there will be a lot of tanks involved, which is why we're talking about it. But so I think it is really important for anyone who's being honest about this potential conflict to acknowledge that we should be on our knees begging the Chinese to forgive us for what our great-grandparents did to China, and anyone who's an English speaker is lumped in with this. And as an Australian, yes, there's no tank element to what we've done to Indigenous Australians, but that was also horrific, and some restitution needs to be made. But the Chinese really copped it, and they have actually been surprisingly forbearing and good-natured about it. But then we come to the issue of Taiwan. Which is just off the coast of China in 1949 when the communists finally defeated the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang Chinese nationalists fled across the strait in their millions to Taiwan. Taiwan has an issue with its people who were indigenous before that, dealing with the Chinese influx from 1949. That's well beyond the scope of this podcast. But, so the Kuomintang were an evil bunch of bastards by any objective reckoning.
But they were capitalist bastards.
They were the anti-communist bastards.
Sorry, anti-communist bastards.
Yeah, and so they got Western support. But you've got to understand from the Chinese perspective, particularly the Chinese ruling class who are from the Communist Party, which has almost no bearing on any historical sense of communism. They're just the ruling elite. The Kuomintang slaughtered their...
Just because they're called the Chinese Communist Party doesn't mean they actually believe in communism or values.
No, but I would also...
It just means they believe in elitism and for people who are...
From their grouping. Yeah. But I would also say that the Chinese communists have been probably the best rulers that China's ever had. And that's an extremely low bar. I'm not saying the best China can ever have. I think China could do a lot better. But historically, they've had some really terrible ruling groups. And the communists have, in many ways, improved the lives of the average Chinese enormously in the time they've been in power. haven't been perfect.
No,
I'm not saying I want to live under that government.
No, is there room for improvement? Yes.
Yes.
But
yeah.
And as you say, I wouldn't want to live there, but they have improved things for the people there.
Yeah. And their grandfathers got murdered by the people who are running Taiwan. Sorry. That gets complicated. The Kuomintang are still one of the two major parties in Taiwan. There is another party that is not Kuomintang. But let's remember a few little historical facts here, or even current facts. No major country has ever recognised Taiwan as an independent country. Taiwan has never declared its independence. Yes, we do not want the Chinese to invade. As you can see on the map, I put it up there. It's 120 kilometres, which is an enormous distance for an amphibious assault, and it's going to be very complicated. And Taiwan making almost all the microchips that exist in the world, I'm guessing they're going to have some really good drone fleets rising up there to inflict damage.
And the other thing to remember, just like in Ukraine and Russia, is a case of it's the politics and the political elite are making these decisions, but the people on the ground, the people who actually live there, a lot of the Taiwanese, their families in China, and a lot of the Chinese, their families in Taiwan. It's a case of the people there go back and forth and they just live their normal lives. It's not a case of you are now crossing the border and your life is in your hands every step you take when you're going from Taiwan to China. It's a case
It's an enormous amount of business and trade as well.
Yeah, is just their lives. They go and it's just different one place to another. They are not at war. They are not the people themselves. See it as a case of, well, I work here, but I live there, and I commute once a week, and that's just what I do, just between like Canberra and Sydney or something like that. It's not a big thing for them, but the politics are at a high level is very antagonistic, and everybody wants to say, well, we need our ideology is the best, and there's nothing you can do, say, or think about it that's going to change our minds, and that's where it gets really. Where people are making ideological decisions that are going to affect people that don't care.
Yeah. Now, trust me, we're going to get to the tanks. Bear with me. There's a few things to note. One, Xi Jinping, who's declared himself president for life of China, which is not a great thing for China. Mm-hmm. Not because Xi Jinping's particularly bad, just because presidents for life aren't good.
Said he wants reunification.
He wants to end the Chinese Civil War that started in the 1920s.
Realistically, he wants the ego boost of...
he wants to be the one.
I want to be the one who has achieved this. I want to be better than Mao. I want to be better than all the others.
Every national leader, in their little hearts, all of them, dreams of winning a great war of conquest. That's a historical fact. The Roman emperors, desperately wanted someone to beat and conquer just so they could have their triumphal march. And that still holds true. So, Xi wants to be the one. And, he's not that old, but he's not going to live forever. So, and the reality that we need to really bear in mind is China has spent a colossal amount of money building the biggest naval shipyard industry the world's ever seen. They are outproducing the US Navy. Right now, they're building more aircraft carriers every year, more submarines, more cruisers, more frigates.
But one of the things to remember about all that, they actually have a very limited coastline for which to deploy them from.
Yes.
Whereas you look at even England has as big a coastline.
That is a big part of what I'm going to talk about with what's happening on the map up here. If you look closely, the Japanese islands extend all the way to the coast of Taiwan. Okay, and from south of Taiwan, you've got the Philippine Islands, and this is this whole thing called the First Island Chain that people get very excited about, particularly the Chinese. If the Chinese were to own Taiwan, they would have open access to the Pacific Ocean that would be impossible to interdict. At the moment, they are contained by Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. So it's no small stakes for them, and particularly if we're going to talk real geopolitics, the ability of their nuclear missile submarines to enter the Pacific untracked and threaten the American West Coast depends on having ownership of Taiwan. So that is important. I'm not saying I want the American West Coast menaced by nuclear missile submarines either. That's not great, but from a Chinese point of view, important.
Mate, and I want to stress this highly, that I also don't want them menacing my beach house on the south coast of Australia.
I don't think you're a major target, but sure.
Look, they have been. There were Japanese subs on that coast.
Yes, they were shelling us. Yes.
70 years ago,
Yeah.
there were steamships that were sunk by Japanese submarines off the south coast of New South Wales.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to go there and not have to worry about that. Until afterwards, in which case diving on the wrecks might actually.
Well, okay, all right. Rob's little selfish argument there aside, let's quickly try and progress through some of this stuff with Taiwan. So the strategic significance of Taiwan is actually huge, even if you didn't have the antagonism of the Chinese Civil War still unresolved. Big deal. But what we have is Taiwan has a bunch of clapped out M60s and some more modern wheeled tanks with big guns. But all they have to do is slot the Chinese tanks as they try and get off the beach. So this not great armoured force Taiwan has is probably quite calculatedly adequate for repelling a force as it comes up the beaches.
What about the T-15s and their air mobile?
Yeah, but they need somewhere to drop them.
No, they're not air deployable. They're air mobile.
Yeah, they need a landing field captured first.
Yes.
And the terrifying thing is, okay, what I'm trying to get here is China has spent a lot of money building an enormous navy and it's still spending it, and they are only doing it to recapture Taiwan. So they are serious. The Chinese ambassador to Australia just this week booked the press club and gave a speech.
I'll just mention that this is the week that Nancy Pelosi who is the House Speaker for the US Congress, had her big visit to Taiwan, which really
seemed like an unnecessary act of provocation to me.
But I know, but she's done it before and she'll do it again. It's just a case of the American politics just influencing the world, saying, yeah, you know what, fuck you guys, we're going to do what we like.
I would say that the Taiwanese interests gave Pelosi's re-election campaigns an enormous amount of money. I don't know that for a fact, but I am willing to guess that.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Sorry, Alan's just said, no, Taiwan, I don't believe, has the M1 yet. I think they've got like 2 of them for evaluation at the moment. Anyway, Taiwan, China, it's big stakes, a big deal. As I was saying with the Chinese ambassador booking the National Press Club to give an address, he was extremely honest and open and should have been applauded by Australians, frankly.
I don't think it would be applauded, but it was. They should recognise
the honesty and the openness was really important. Saying this is our strategic
recognising
interest.
what he was saying of using force is our least option for reunification. So
yeah.
So he's saying it's going to happen. I'm not going to say when it's going to happen, but and I agree. It is being very open and honest in a diplomatic environment that saying those things is not a bad thing. So that we understand this is where things are at.
Well, it is always a helpful start to a negotiation for both sides to be clear about what their objectives are. And for that, I am thankful. I don't necessarily agree with his idea of putting all of the Taiwanese population into re-education camps. That seems a little unpleasant to me. And
really slow down the production of PlayStation 5s, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Let's keep our eye on the real prize here. But yeah. As with all these wars, the best thing would be for no one to fight the war.
Yeah. If nobody turned up,
that
would be really nice.
But I just think it's really worth being realistic that China is not spending all this money on a navy to not fight this war. And the Chinese are being really clear about what they expect and want. And it would be worthwhile paying attention to that. And people who are like, yay, China are the enemy, I find that really tiresome. I think that's about all I've got to say, except let's talk about the tanks a little bit more.
T-15 versus M60?
It'd murder it. It'd absolutely moose it. Yeah.
But with lots of reactive armour strapped on the outside of the M60.
Yeah, maybe, but...
they both got the same gun. They've both got L7s.
Yes. Yeah, they do, but the
T-15 hasn't got any armour.
Yeah, but the M60 doesn't have any armour that's going to keep out the...
L7.
Yeah. And the command and control systems that have been published... Now, maybe the Taiwanese have really upgraded their M60s?
Well, I was about to say, I think they know a thing or two about computers, John.
Yeah, they know a lot about computers. They know more than our country does, and frankly, they know more than the United States does about making the chips.
But
but this is why I think it's actually going to be the drones that'll matter. But
and remember, the Chinese are deploying the T-15s as part of their amphibious forces. So the People's Republic of China Naval Armed Amphibious Forces or something. That's a really long acronym.
It's probably like 2 Chinese characters. But
yes, water tanks.
Yeah,
there you go. So the Furphy's coming back.
Hey. Yeah. This is no small deal, though. If this one kicks off, all our lives are going to change.
I'm kind of hoping that the de-escalations that have started happening this week are going to continue, and they'll return back to the frothing boiling point that they were at, but with the expectation that next time things will go slightly, when things escalate, they'll go slightly higher next time, which is something that everybody needs to understand, is that yes, we might return to where it was before, but the ceiling of the escalation has just raised up.
I think, and this is the reason why I talk so much about the preceding Chinese history, though. Chinese are not screwing around. They will take Taiwan back. And I think at this point, the smart thing is to negotiate how they take Taiwan back and ensure that a bit like the way Hong Kong is a different system. Admittedly, that still is fraught with problems, although it'd be less fraught if the CIA didn't keep messing around there. Getting Taiwan incorporated formally back into China with safeguards for Taiwanese civil life would seem like the smartest way forward for everyone, rather than letting this drag out until it's a challenge to American power.
But how much of the Taiwanese politics is still based around the idea that, well, we were the ruling...
the Kuomintang is still based on that, so that's 50%.
Yeah, well, as I'm saying, is that... so for those who don't know, there is a portion of the Taiwanese government that's... or Taiwanese politics...
It's in favour of reunification as well, but they want to run it.
Yeah. They just because they lost... they fled to mainland China in 1949 doesn't mean they ceded control of China. They still see themselves as the what should be the rulers of China. And I don't think anybody's on board that train anymore, except for them. But it is a factor that needs to be discussed when looking at all these things, and that part of the Taiwanese politics is saying, no, we're not giving up because we still rule the rest of China. So it's not. There are no easy solutions to the problem.
My opinion is worth almost nothing, but
no.
I would still say that the smartest thing at this point is a carefully negotiated reunification, and that's what China's telling us, is that, if you want to fight a world war, we'll do it, but we're not messing around. And now is the time to negotiate a similar deal to Hong Kong or Macau for Taiwan.
Now, we've talked about Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
We've got something else coming up, John, that we need to talk about.
Osama Fest.
Osama Fest in Cairns in 2 weeks' time for us. That is going to be exciting times for us. So we're going to go there, see tanks.
Yes.
Talk about tanks.
Talk to our fans who are coming, and there's quite a few who've let us know. So
that's great. We'd love to see you guys.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Yeah. And have a great old time, and get out of the cold of Canberra and see some of the lovely environment of Cairns and the nice warm weather up there. And
it's a tropical paradise, so it's still a week and a half away. So there's time to book your tickets, folks.
Yeah,
and,
we'll be there, and we're going to be looking at tanks.
Mm-hmm.
What sort of tanks? Lots of tanks.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of armoured cars and things because they're making up the numbers, but there's still a lot of tanks.
There's a lot of tanks. We're going to look at a lot of tanks. So for those who are going to be there, and for those who I'm sure we'll figure out what we're going to do while we're up there, and some filming, some talking, some photos, some chatting away.
I would say if you're coming, follow us on Facebook, and we'll use that to coordinate with what pubs we're going to go to and that sort of
Do you
thing.
think we'll go to the pub, John?
Yeah.
I think we might go to the pub.
Yeah.
And just remember, boys and girls, if you are wearing a Totally Tank t-shirt like ours, we will buy you a beer at a pub.
Yeah, we'll buy you one beer if you're wearing the t-shirt.
Because
Yes.
we love you all.
Yeah. Okay, it's been awesome, folks. Thank you so much for the folks who've watched through us who do it live, and thank you to everyone who's absorbing the recording later. And yeah, we will be sharing some content from Alzheimer Fest.
Not sure what yet, but we'll do it.
Follow us on YouTube in particular to get that, and we will talk to you soon. Okay.
Take care all.
Goodbye, folks.